China's transformation, the success story, and the success trap. SAGE has been part of the global academic community since 1965, supporting quality writing that transforms society and our understanding of individuals, groups, and cultures. We are honored to have Professor Manoranjan Mohanty as our author. Dr. Mohanty is a renowned political scientist and Chinese scholar. He is Vice President of the Council for Social Development and Honorary Fellow at ICS, that is Institute of Chinese Studies. Dr. Mohanty has been the Director of ICS and Editor of China Report. Formerly, he taught in the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. He has been on visiting assignments in several universities and has taught in institutes across the globe. We also have an august panel for today's discussion. We are honored to have Professor Mujkun Dubey, Sri Ashok K. Kantha, Sri Jairam Ramesh, Sri Shiv Shankar Menon, Professor Utsa Patnaik, Professor Patricia Uberai with us today. I would request you to come to desk and have a seat here. Probably Professor Patricia Uberai is not here yet. We'll wait for her. Professor Mujkun Dubey is the President of the Council for Social Development and Chairman of the Asian Development Research Institute. Professor Dubey was an ambassador and Indian Foreign Secretary. He was a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and Professor Emeritus at the Foreign Service Institute. He is also author of several books. Sri Jairam Ramesh is a well-known politician and renowned Indian economics, former minister and currently member of parliament. Author of many important books, Ramesh has been a columnist of national newspapers. He is a founding member of the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. Since 2002, he has been visiting fellow in ICS. The present chairman of advisory board of ICS, Sri Shiv Shankar Menon, is distinguished diplomat and served as the National Security Advisor of India under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He had previously served as the Foreign Secretary. Prior to that, he was Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and Ambassador to China and Israel. Well-known economics Professor Utsa Patnaik. Well-known economics Professor Utsa Patnaik has taught at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in Jawaharlal Nehru University until 2010. She is now Emeritus Professor at School of Social Sciences in JNU. She has authored many important books. Professor Patricia Uberai, eminent sociologist, Professor of Social Change and Development in the Institute of Economic Growth. She is currently chairperson and honorary fellow at the ICS. Sri Ashok K. Kantha is the director of the Institute of Chinese Studies. He was the Indian ambassador to China. He has served as secretary to the Ministry of External Affairs and been the High Commissioner of India in Sri Lanka and Malaysia. We are honored to have you all here with us today. Now I would request Mr. Vivek Mehra, Managing Director and CEO of SAGE India, to address the audience. After his address, Professor Mujkun Dubey will formally launch the book and then we'll commence with the panel discussion. Thank you.
So, valued author, eminent panelists. Okay, it's a mic. It's like a weapon. Very. Friends, as a publisher, there are many things that are said, many things that are not said. The eminent panelists will tell you about the book. The author will tell you about his experience. But I thought that since the subject is China, I'll give you a publisher's perspective of China. So this morning I was in a meeting with a lady who had just come in from Germany, and we were discussing the the International Publishers Association and the Congress that's going to be held next month. And so she provided a very interesting tidbit on China. So she is also a Chinese scholar. And she said that the rise of China brought China to the discussion table with the Publishers Association. They wanted a seat at that table, and their entry was being fought tooth and nail. And the reason that it was being fought was because the Publishers Association stands for free speech, women empowerment, freedom of expression, and these are things that are not naturally associated with China. And of course, the Chinese kept upping the ante of how they could participate and how they could at least benefit the association, and they actually managed to divide the publishers globally. So you had one section that wanted the Chinese to be part of the Publishers Association, and mind you, there isn't an independent publishing house in China. There isn't one. They're all, some way or the other, they are connected to the Chinese government and have to go a very strict line. And so she said, they managed to divide the publishers globally. You had a section that said, we should welcome them in, they're part of the Global Alliance, and there is a lot of business that is generated out of China. And another section that said, no, we won't be doing it. But last year, I don't know how many academics followed what happened there, but there was a publishing house that was censured. A whole bunch of articles were asked to be pulled down. And it was more in the form of a request, and when the Chinese request, you generally comply, and that's exactly what happened. And then the academic community was up in arms and said that this is not done. And so every publishing house went and started introspecting. What would we do if we took this kind of a stand or we were approached that way? Let's say that it suffices that there was sufficient cause that China, sufficient concern that China raised, which kind of affected publishers globally. And each one had to come out with a policy statement of, well, how are we going to react to this kind of statement? Sage was not immune to it. We have our own interpretation of what's acceptable and what isn't. But the point is, they are here. And that's what probably this panel is best equipped to talk about. I'm the most ill-equipped to do that. And so it's best that I hand over to them. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and welcome.
Friends, it's a very important moment for me personally because this work is a product of more than 30 years of work, and some of my colleagues and students who helped me in the early years of research are now professors, some of them even retired. So I take this occasion a very important moment in my life. And thank you, Vivek. Sales had a complaint that I only gave them edited volumes. And this I had actually committed to Tejaswar Rao. At the end of my first decade of research, he said, this you must give to us. And here it is. I have so many people to thank, but that will take a long time because I want to use my 4.5 minutes to talk about the book. I will mention my colleagues in the China group. Giridhar Shankar, Mira Sinha, G.P. Deshpande, they are no longer with us, but Vinod Khanna, Patricia and I are still around from that group. And and Patricia read the first draft in 2005 and made me work for many years, and I have tried my best to do this. Professor Dubey, I'm most grateful. In fact, this title finally took shape after several discussions with him, and what was completed in ICS and CST, where I'm currently located. Now this book is really an exercise in self-education, because after my first decade or two of research on China, Chinese revolution, ideological and theoretical questions and macro questions, when I tried to understand the actual operation of these policies on the ground, I found that not only the books were insufficient, scholars in China and abroad had only partial answers or no answers. So I went on and on pursuing this project to find out how the ideological and policy formulations worked on the ground. So it's a book, each chapter of which has a micro study of Wuxi, Wuxi's rural area to begin with, the role of Wuxi, and then the macro. Every chapter has that. Of course, the first two chapters are the macro strategy, development strategy of the last 4 decades. And then another chapter, the strategy as it is seen from below. The second important element that I would like to highlight is that the theory and practice have many gaps, even though Deng Xiaoping said, feel the stones as you wade through the water in the river. Touch the stones. That is, you change according to the circumstances. But the path was very clear. And that's the conclusion I have here on the path. This kind of path, what kind of successes it achieves, and what limitations it structurally has. So it's about theory and practice. My understanding of Marxist theory, I wanted to test I have written on Mao and that period, and now in the Tang period and in the succeeding years. Now, how socialism operates in practice. And then as teachers in universities, we teach political theory, development theory, comparative politics, public administration and so on. And there were some general development theory questions, development policy questions. And this is also a study where development theory questions that any public administration or policy analyst would like to address, I try to address. I would finally say that I would like the panelists, I'm most grateful to them, and I couldn't earn a better reward than to have the consent of such eminent panelists as today. I'd like the panelists to take this discussion forward, critique my formulations. You can see that it is a dialectical formulation on most of the issues, and why I call it a success story as well as a success trap. That even when during the last 10 years, Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping are addressing those problems of inequality, regional disparity, corruption, political dysfunctionality, we would call it political authoritarianism and so on, environmental decay and so on. They are addressing these questions, but they are not succeeding in overcoming these problems. That is what I call the success trap. So this is what I have to offer, and I look forward to a very exciting time. Thank you very much.
Now I request to release the book. I would like to request Sri Ashok Kanta to moderate the panel and start the discussion.
Professor Mohanty, my friends and colleagues on this podium, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen present in this hall. As Professor Mohanty pointed out, this book has been long in making, and I have been one of those who have insisted on him that he should finish this job as soon as he can. And I am therefore absolutely delighted that this book has now seen the light of the day. I think it is therefore also a great opportunity for me to have been asked to write the book, which I have done. Now, after going through some parts of the book, particularly the introduction and the concluding chapter, I have come to the conclusion that this book is very different from the usual books that have come out in galore on the rise of China. And the weight, therefore, was very much worthwhile. I think Professor Mohanty has brought to bear on the analysis in this book his theoretical insight as a political scientist, and in this particularly his knowledge of Marxism and capitalist development, his engagement with Chinese development since the time of Mao Zedong. And you remember, this book is not a kind of the only outcome of his engagement. In between, he has come out with numerous papers and even books on China. This is a kind of a essence of what he has been working for all these years. And his experience of the development of the Wuxi region of China, where he has been visiting from time to time and keeping himself up to date on the developments there. The other thing is that if the name of the author is stamped out of the book, I would not be able to make out whether it is written by an economist or a political scientist, because he has used a lot of data in this book, and he has marshaled them very competently and with a professional skill. And I think this is quite remarkable for somebody who is not an economist. The other main feature of this book is that I think he has enabled us to understand some of the things that we have been reading about, but didn't have a clear notion of them. I mean, for example, how the Chinese model is different from the other models of development practiced in the contemporary period. How this model, in spite of bringing in the market element in a big way, still is different. Then how this model has encountered the discontents of the culmination of the market process in globalization. A discontent which is now manifest in its very stark form all over the world, and the quintessential symbol of which is President Donald Trump. I think, and how the pursuit of even modified form of capitalism pioneered by Deng Xiaoping, forgive me for the pronunciation, actually has become undistinguishable from the typical capitalist development in China. And how today it has assumed a form which is like riding a tiger from which you can't dismount without being devoured. And the kind of alternative that the Chinese have been looking for, which is a part of the global quest for this. Now, before I conclude, I would like to make a comment on one substantive point. And it is the reference in the introduction of this book and elsewhere about the Chinese leadership on the strength of its rise for the existing world order at a time when it has been brought to the stage of almost extinction by the policies adopted by President Trump. It is a status quoist approach, and in this, if I can take you a little back in history, you know that the Chinese did not really engage with the world order underpinned by the UN system till 1971. From 1971 to 1995 or so, they were silent observers, learning the ways, acquainting themselves with the intricacies of the system, and in the process taking advantage of it for their own development wherever they could. From 1995 onwards, they started engaging in it actively, but that engagement was in the nature of becoming a part of it, particularly in the context of their joining the WTO, 5-year period, 2002 to 2007, if I remember the date accurately. And then their realization that they have to gain the maximum from the status quo situation in the world. A realization which continues till today. On the other hand, India was a non-status quo power right from the beginning, so far as the world order is concerned. As a matter of fact, right from the beginning of the establishment of the UN, India had a different notion of what UN should become from what its founders had. And this is reflected in Pandit Nehru's repeated comments in his speeches before independence and after independence. And the last speech he made in September 1963, a few months before his death, about UN still being an embryonic form or the foundation for a world government. And he had no hesitation in using the term world government and continued to do it till September 1963. So we tried to change the order after that, and we took major initiatives from time to time. I cannot say the extent to which we succeeded in that, but I can certainly say that we tilted at the windmill at regular intervals. And I'm afraid our present generation diplomats are deprived of even this excitement after the early 1990s, when we became also a status quo power. Now the issue today is that the world order, as I pointed out, is threatened to be brought to extinction or total disintegration. Until now, one used to use the word enfeeblement, but now it has to be replaced by disintegration. This is where it is being brought to. Now, what is the role of India in that context? Chinese have come out, at least for the status quo, which is itself a bold move, and their view is shared by a large number of countries of the world, particularly the Western countries of Europe, particularly. But as Professor Mohanty had very rightly pointed out in the introduction of the book, that this order is unjust, unfair, unequitable for the transformation of which we have constantly been trying. Now, can we resume that role as of now in the context of the kind of foreign policy that we are following? I think I do not have, or don't want to use any words for characterizing our foreign policy today, other than saying that it has essentially becoming reacting to situations in the interest of in the light of our interest, and managing events, particularly visits of leaders. This is what it has got reduced to, but I am an optimist. I still hope that we can really take initiative for a revamped, reconstructed, and restructured United Nations. There is no dearth of blueprints for that. Just 2 minutes. There are many of them, and I think one of the blueprints I had myself prepared in 1995-96 in my paper called Multilateralism Besieged. And since then there have been many other blueprints, particularly by Butrus Ghali in the introduction to the book, a first script for me, edited by Professor Mohanty, and many other places. And India can still take up that blueprint and mobilize support first of the IPSA countries, South Africa, Brazil, and then other developing countries. And then, but I must say at the end that whatever, even the modicum of chance of success that it may have, will not be possible without the cooperation of China. This is a contradiction in term. I have pointed out how in the Chinese realistic calculation, and Kissinger has called China as a hyper-realist power in his book on Notes on China. So in spite of that, there is a likelihood, it seems to be remote, but without their cooperation, even the limited success that one can envisage is not possible. But I would again say that we will go in for that, if not for nothing else, at least for the excitement of it. Thank you.
Please move up, there are some chairs here. Thank you very much, Professor Dubey. Point you made about China being a status quo is power. Without elaborating on that theme, Professor Mohanty has also made a very similar point in introduction to his book. It is an honor for me to be asked to moderate this panel discussion. We have a very formidable panel, including Shri Jairam Ramesh, Ambassador Shankar Menon, Professor Utsa Patnaik, Professor Patricia Oberoi. What we'll do in the limited time available, I'll request the 4 panelists to spend about 10-12 minutes each to make their opening remarks. Thereafter, they can pose questions to each other if they so like, and we'll open the floor for discussion. I'll begin with Shri Jairam Ramesh.
Thank you, Ashok. So let me join the others in congratulating Professor Mohanty in distilling 30 years of wisdom and experience into this book. I have read this with great interest. I agree with many of the things that he has said. but I disagree with many of the things that he has said, and I would rather focus, to make this interesting, on the items that I disagree with. I think this is a political scientist's book, even though there's a lot of data in this book. To me, the big question that is not answered in this book, which any student of India and China has to answer, is till 1990, not many of us really know this or recognize this, till 1990, by any indicator of economic performance, GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, GDP per capita, market determined exchange rates, India was higher than China. India's per capita income till 1990 was higher than that of China. The great divergence, to use a phrase that China scholars relate to, the great divergence between India and China starts in the decade 1990 to 2000. And then it takes off between the decade 2000 to 2010. Professor Mohanty doesn't answer this question, really. He takes the Chinese success as a given, and he locates the roots of China's success in what he calls rural reforms. And he contrasts that with the Indian experience in the post-1991 period, which he doesn't say so, which is maybe by default, it's more industry-focused, less agriculture-focused, unlike the case of China. And I'll come to that in a little bit. So I think the first question really is, why this great divergence took place? And in this book, it's remarkable that in this book, I find virtually no reference to the role of international trade. I mean, international trade has been the fundamental driver of the great divergence between India and China in the post-90 period. But if you read this book, you won't know that. So this is my first bone I want to pick with Professor Mohanty, that how can you look at the Chinese success without really understanding, coming to grips with the role that international trade has played? And I leave aside foreign investment and so on, but I think fundamental was trade. Trade drove the investment. So this is the first point I wish to make. The second point I want to make is on page 47. Tantalizingly, there is a long paragraph on comparing India and China. And the short point is, Professor Mohanty says, China succeeded in the post-90 period. China took off because all the things that it did in the pre-90 period. Agriculture reforms, rural reforms, which really starts in the late 80s, in the late 70s. Now, I think this is a profound misreading of what happened in India in 1991. To dismiss the Indian reforms of 1991, as Professor Mohanty does, and of course Professor Mohanty is reflecting a certain ideological approach, to dismiss the 91 reforms as World Bank dictated, I think this is a cliched mantra. The fact of the matter is that the modern sector of the Indian economy had become a drag on the economy. The terms of trade had turned against agriculture because of high levels of protection to industry. So unless you did what you did in 91, which was reform the trade system, unless you did what you did in 91, which was completely open up the economy in terms of deregulation, you really had run into a dead end. So therefore, I think the nuance of what happened in 91, to say that the Chinese reforms had been discussed for a long time, and then the Indian reforms came like a bang because of the World Bank, I think is a profound misreading. If you look at the history of economic reforms in the 80s, the discussion that took place in the 80s, in fact in 91, what got implemented what was on the anvil and had been under discussion since the mid-80s, if not the early 80s. So this is the second problem I have with this book, which is that as long as Professor Mohanty is confining himself to China, he's very erudite. But the moment he brings in India, I begin to have problems with him, because I think he takes an excessively ideological approach to this comparative picture between India and China. I just end by my third point. Towards the last paragraph of this book, Professor Mohanty accepts the fact that the Chinese success is a capitalist success, and the Chinese trap is a capitalist. High resource intensity, high energy intensity, high consumption, environmental degradation, these are all phenomena that we associate, Professor Mohanty associates with capitalist economies. And he concludes by saying that while capitalism with Chinese characteristics has been the driver of China's emergence as a world power, the trap, the success trap, is inherent in the capitalist model or the trajectory that China has adopted. To me, the question is, which I wish Professor Mohanty had addressed, the real question is, can India, which is on the Chinese path, avoid the Chinese trap? One big advantage that we have is that we are a latecomer to the high growth club. And one of the advantages of being a latecomer to the high growth club is that you don't necessarily have to repeat the mistakes made by the earlier high growth countries. First Japan, South Korea, East Asia, China. And what is that mistake? That mistake is high energy intensity, high consumption, rapid urbanization, which in turn fuels high energy and high consumption, leading to environmental degradation, which Professor Mohanty talks about. So can India today, poised for a 7 to 7.5% GDP growth over the next 2.5 to 3 decades, can it take a different trajectory than what the Chinese did in the early 90s? This is a big question. I personally believe that we can, but there are factors that are militating against it. And I think the biggest factor militating against it, which again is not discussed in Professor Mohanty's book, is the demographic factor. Right through the period of Chinese economic expansion, China's population was virtually stable. But in the period of India's expansion over the next 30 years, we are going to add a third of our population over the next 3 decades. A young population, a growing population, is a recipe for more consumption. So on the one side, you will have pressure for increased consumption as a way of improving your standard of living, nothing wrong with that. On the other side, you will have pressure to adopt a lower energy intensive, a less environmentally degrading model of development. I think this is the dilemma that India faces. This is not a dilemma that China faced 25 years ago or 30 years ago, because the demographics of China were completely different than the demographics of India. And there is no way we can avoid this demographics, because it is built into our population base. We are, whether we like it or not, going to be 1.7 billion by the year 2050. We are 1.24 billion, we are going to add 400 million people. What that means for energy intensity, what that means for environment, what that means for consumption, I think is something that we need to work on. I hope Professor Mohanty does not feel that I've abused his hospitality. We have been having these arguments for the last 25 years, and I have learned much from him. I have read this book. It's a great book because this is the season for China books. 2 weeks ago, another book on China was released by a Swedish journalist, and day after tomorrow, Shiv Shankar, I and Manoranjan are going to be in another book discussion where another book on China is going to be released. But I must say, of all the three, This is academically the most rigorous. This is based on field work. This is based on local level political economy issues which are not normally discussed when it comes to the Chinese success story. And I want to congratulate Professor Mohanty and Sage for a real value addition to the literature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As always, you have made your points succinctly, directly, and without mincing words. May I request Master Shankar Menon to make his remarks.
Thank you, Ashok. And let me join the others in congratulating Professor Mohanty on this book. It's a very useful and valuable book, and I can recommend it without any hesitation to anyone who's interested in China's development experience. And for those who were worried that China watching in India is dead, it's alive and well, and the book, I think, proves that. But since Jairam started us 3 points, let me make 3 points, but I will talk about what's in the book rather than what's not in the book, because there is so much more in the universe that I wish were different and were included. There's 3 reasons why I think this is really a valuable book. Firstly, it's written from an Indian perspective. And because it makes these explicit and implicit comparisons between India's development experience and China's. You might not agree with what he says about India's experience, or even what he says about China's experience. But it's based on a wealth of detail, on a lifetime of experience studying it, and just for that reason it is well worth reading. Because there's so much similarities in the problems that reform has thrown up in both countries. And neither has still found actually an acceptable, politically acceptable solution to many of these problems. The book itself argues that the consequences of the pattern of development that China chose, inequality, distress migration, environmental degradation, gender issues, many of these are actually very difficult to handle today. And this is what I think gives the book real value, the idea of the success trap, that because China and the Chinese elite is so integrated into the global capitalist process, and because of the nature of the Chinese party and state system, it is, as Mr. Dubey said, a tiger that you can't get off. And China's development now is path dependent to an extent which there's no longer a question of feeling the stones underfoot and changing your track, because that path dependence both China and India today experience. It's much more difficult today for us the easy reforms are over, and the choices are also much more limited because of the successes of the past. And that's a lesson I think that is well worth getting. It's interesting. In both countries, the nature of reform and the development that it brought with it have actually brought to power similar authoritarian leadership. And the political consequences of that reform, I think it's interesting. Much of this is unstated and implicit in the book, but I think it's worth reading because of the thoughts that it triggers about this. And for me, the real value of the book is this idea, at least I was left with the impression, that nothing short of a cataclysm, another cultural revolution, can actually get China out of this success trap that she has got into. Maybe I'm overstating it. I'm sure Professor Mohanty will correct me if I am. But I see a contradiction in the book, because somewhere later in the book he says that, and I quote, China's leadership will continue to attend to those problems creatively and consciously. How is it a trap? So I'm not quite sure where he actually comes down on this, but that's an issue which is a matter of judgment. Secondly, of course, the book is based on extensive fieldwork in Wuxi over many years. There's data in there, and this connection between central policy, declaratory, not always implemented, and local practice. This connection, it's very rare to find in one book, and I found that valuable, even though, frankly, to my mind, it's still unclear how central declaratory policy actually gets translated into local actions, and how local situations are converted back into changes in central policy. I mean, the actual transmission mechanism and how this happens, I think, is a problem. But what you have here is a very good description of how it has been over the last 30 years or so. And the last idea is something that I found interesting, is the idea of China's development as a model for other countries. Or the idea that somehow we are on a Chinese track, which, by the way, I don't agree. Now, this is something that President Xi Jinping spoke of in the 19th Party Congress last October. For the first time since Mao, you had a Chinese leader saying that we're a model, not of revolution this time, but of development. And you see more and more references in the Chinese official statements about the Chinese method, the Chinese model. I mean, they translate Zhongguo Fangan in different ways in different places. Now, this, I think, deserves a lot more attention, because frankly, to me, on the face of it, there is no other country which has China's characteristics. Nor are the conditions which allowed China's tremendous growth spurt over 30 years to take place ever going to be replicated. I mean, you're not going to have 2 decades of globalization of the kind of world that you had when China, in the 90s and the first decade of this century before the global financial crisis. So it's very hard to see how that model can really be replicated anywhere else. And for me, this is a very hard... What's happening instead is we're all taking bits and pieces of whatever we like. It's like blind man and the elephant. And we take what we like out of the Chinese experience. We don't take it as a whole, and then we deal with it in very strange ways. But this is something that I said is useful, and there's a lot of material in this book which actually provokes you to look at this question. And I think this is something that maybe, if there is future work, I would really recommend that this be done. So all in all, for me, this is a very useful, objective, relatively objective description of the Chinese development experience. Relative because there are very few absolutes in this field that you can be sure of. Not the statistics, not even the terms that are used to describe the Chinese economy. What I liked about it was that Professor Mohanty gives credit where it's due. He doesn't just accept today's fashion of regarding the Hu Jintao period as the lost decade, for instance. I mean, he gives credit to Hu Jintao and Jiabao for recognizing the problems for what they did, goes further back. So I would strongly recommend this book, even though there are bits and pieces where I am not so sure. He speaks, for instance, of the Chinese seem to be more interested in preserving the existing unequal, unjust world economic and financial order, out of which they benefited greatly. They certainly benefited, but I think that we are now at a stage where the Chinese are actually seeking to remake the international order in their own favor, rather than to preserve an essentially Western order from which they benefited, but in different times and in a very different context. But that's a much bigger argument, and that's something that maybe we need to discuss in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In your 3 points, you have covered so much ground. May I now invite Professor Utsap to speak for that? Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty, for, as everyone has said, a very interesting book, and of course a very useful book which covers a very large range of issues of Chinese development, both in the pre-reform period as well as the reform period. For me, reading the book paradoxically induced a kind of sense of nostalgia and of even sadness, particularly the discussion of the pre-reforms period. Because the reason the Chinese development experience after liberation was so fascinating for so many of us is that it was much more than simply pursuing a growth and development strategy. What it entailed, I think, was a completely different vision of the way society and economy could be organized. Completely different from the capitalist vision. And what was happening for at least 30 years after liberation was an attempt to realize this vision of a society which would aim at justice for all its citizens, which will aim at egalitarianism, for the abolition of the exploitation of man by man, and of woman by man, incidentally. And to an amazing extent, I think this strategy did succeed. Because if you look at the extent of income inequality and asset inequality in China on the eve of the reforms, it was perhaps one of the lowest in the world, which was a remarkable achievement for a population of the size of China's, the largest population in the world. And in terms of health and education indicators as well, the achievements were truly stupendous. So I have been, it will not surprise you to know, that I have been an unabashed critic of the economic policies of the reform period practically from the beginning, as soon as one realized where they were heading. For the simple reason that the pursuit of market orientation in production, the pursuit of profit as an objective of production, and not just market orientation involving the domestic market, but market orientation embracing the global capitalist market, is fundamentally incompatible with the aim of preserving an egalitarian and just society. It was bound to lead to inequalities. It was bound to lead to a recrudescence of exploitative social relations. And therefore, from the beginning, I have been critical of this from a point of view which is probably not acceptable to most of the panelists here, and not even acceptable to many people on the left, because there is a tendency on the left to try to justify everything that is done in a socialist society. Whereas I have a very different attitude. I think one has to criticize, because unless one is critical, there is no forward movement. It's no use just being yes people, going along with whatever is being done, without asking the question, how is it affecting the ordinary population? And one of the plus points of Professor Mohanty's books, from my point of view, is that he does not shy away from looking at the negative implications of the economic reforms in China. And they have been quite severe. In fact, I don't think even Professor Mohanty's book probably documents the extent of the negative repercussions. And what I would like to do is just point out a couple of aspects of China's so-called success story. I say so-called because I have problems even with the title. Yes, China is regarded as highly successful. But from what point of view? From the point of view of GDP growth, no doubt. From the point of view of its rise as a global power. But are these the criteria of success with which the Chinese Revolution was undertaken? And for which so many people sacrificed their lives? I don't think so. I think the objectives were very different. And to a very large extent, I think those objectives have been subverted and undermined in the pursuit of goals which essentially have nothing to do with socialism at all. So the two aspects I would like to emphasize, which perhaps need more attention, and probably it will not surprise at all the people who have heard me speak earlier what those two aspects are. One is the whole question of food security. Now in China, interestingly, if you look at the decade from 1997 to 2007, cereal production was stagnant. I mean, it's not correct to say it was stagnant. It was around 450 million ton in 1997. Then it declined steeply and rose again to reach 450 million ton 10 years later, by 2007. So this decade was a lost decade for China. And why did this happen? It happened for exactly the same reason, and it's quite correct to point out that the impact on China of export orientation and globalization has been very similar to the impact on India of following reform policies. It happened because China is an even more land-short economy than India is. And if you are going to pursue exports madly, and what were these exports mainly? A very large component were textiles. Textiles require raw cotton. And despite being the largest cotton producer in the world, China also is the largest importer of raw cotton. But within the Chinese economy, there had to be large-scale diversion of food-producing land to production of cotton and other export crops. The cotton was not directly exported. It was turned into textiles which were then exported. So this export drive, this highly so-called successful export drive, which earned it a lot of foreign exchange, no doubt, which pushed up the GDP growth rate, entailed a very heavy cost for the people. That is, the per capita food grain supply went down drastically in China over this decade. The same thing happened in India. This is something that our official publications don't talk about. But there was a steep decline in per capita food grain supply. And by food grains, I'm not referring to only the grain which is directly consumed, but the total supply. That is, if you take everything that grain is used for, as food, as livestock feed, for producing livestock products, processing, as well as industrial use, that index has gone down both in China and in India. But there is no mention of it in Professor Mohanty's book. Perhaps because it is only now that some of the braver Chinese economists have started talking about the lost decade. After 2007, particularly after the global grain crisis of 2008 and the steep rise in prices, the Chinese authorities woke up very belatedly to the problem, and they started reversing their policy. And by now, by 2017, their grain output is 100 million tons higher than it was in 2007. But remember, the current grain output should have been achieved 10 years ago. So they lost those 10 years. The second closely related issue to which I would draw your attention, and this is common to both India, not only India and China, but the whole of the developing world, is that one has to have a very critical attitude and take with a very large pinch of salt the claims of decline in poverty. Because there has been no greater intellectual scam, probably in the history of economics, than poverty estimation and the claim that poverty has declined. And this scam is being carried out to this day by the World Bank. And the main reason it is a scam, by scam I don't mean that the people who are doing poverty estimates are consciously fudging the data. What happens is that a certain methodology of estimation is followed, which is incorrect, which is academically and logically incorrect, which will automatically lead to your showing poverty reduction, even though in reality poverty may be rising. So I have written at least a dozen papers on this. I don't want to go into the details here. But I would just like to point out to you that this methodology has been followed in China as well, not only in India. By 2011, the poverty line in China, the rural poverty line, which was supposed to cover not only the food expenditure, but also all other expenditure, just as our poverty line is supposed to cover not only one person's food expenditure, but all other expenditures also. In China, it was, at the end of 2011, 3.5 yuan per day, per person. Attending a seminar in Shanghai in 2008, I asked my Chinese colleagues, how much will 3.5 yuan purchase? Will it buy a kilogram of rice? They said no. The minimum price of 1 kilogram is 4 yuan. Now this 3.5 yuan at the then prevailing exchange rate with the Indian rupee gives us 30 rupees a day. That is very similar to the official poverty line in India for the same year, which was 28 point something rupees per day in rural India. This is absurd. You know, a poverty line which will not even buy you a kilo of rice, is supposed to cover a person's entire food expenditure, medical bills, utilities, clothing, everything, rent for one day. So what you have as poverty estimates are spurious. They're as spurious for China as they are for India. Actual poverty is much, much higher than what you get by following the erroneous estimation methods which are being followed by the World Bank and by national governments. And I've written a lot on that. Currently, rural poverty from the latest data following the correct method is around 68% of rural population, 66% of urban population. The official poverty ratios for India as a whole, for the latest poverty, is less than a quarter of the entire population. But one thing one must say about China is that the Chinese authorities are much more pragmatic when they find that there are thousands of acts of protest all over rural China. They realized that something wrong has been going on, and they initiated programs for increasing the consumption level in China, for providing a modicum of affordable health and education facilities which had been priced out of the reach of the majority of rural Chinese by the reforms, just as they had been in India. And in December 2011, they practically doubled the poverty line from 3.5 to 6.8 or something like that. So at a stroke, they more than doubled the poverty percentage in China. So poverty is not as low as is being claimed, and in fact the Chinese authorities, by doing this, themselves have tacitly admitted that all their previous estimates and claims were wrong. But they at least did that. In our country, Professor Tendulkar only raised the poverty line by 16%, and only the rural poverty line, which has made no difference whatsoever, or very little difference to the estimation of poverty. I think I've probably taken more of your time than was allotted to me, so I'll stop there. But again, thank Professor Mohanty for really a very interesting book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik, for bringing up some very important issues. I would now request Professor Patricia O'Brien to make her remarks.
I'd like to begin by thanking Sage Publications, CSD, ICS, for giving me this opportunity. What I have to say is rather on a different wavelength, and certainly not as contentious or interesting as the comments that have been made so far, but I will go ahead nonetheless. For me, this moment is a really joyful experience. It's a joyful experience personally, and it's a joyful experience professionally. This is, I think, a major work, a leading and pioneering monographic work from an Indian academic working mainly in India, as Ambassador Shiv Shankar said. And I don't mean that in a patronizing sense, or even in an apologetic sense, just in a realistic sense. Because I think we need to recognize the difficulties of carrying out research of this nature from a location in India under present conditions, though they are have changed for the better over the last 30 years since Professor Mohanty began. When he began this work, the small group which later became ICS were for the first time, after years lost, no travel to China, no first-hand acquaintance. They were one by one slowly getting the opportunity to go for a week or two or three to travel in China. That was 20 years after the boom of the 1950s. And I remember very clearly that when each of them came back, we had a little session with them, and we discussed avidly what they'd seen, what they'd heard, who they'd talked to, how they'd been escorted here and there, and it was a sort of something quite momentous. So the problem of access through this vacant period from the 50s to the late 70s, even further into the 80s, and even now, is something that we have to recognize and that we badly need to correct as soon or as much as we can against the bureaucratic inertia which is imprisoning us. The second point I'd like to make is that this book also shows, in my opinion, what an Indian or non-Western perspective can bring to bear in the understanding of China. I think, again, Ambassador Menon made this point. From a location in India, there is a sort of visceral engagement with China, for better or for worse, that everyone cares, and in a way you recognize the problems that are being addressed and the aspirations that are being fulfilled and not fulfilled, for whom, by whom, and how. So, I think from a perspective in India, and with the social science that we have here, there is the possibility of, and we've seen it in this panel already, of a much more interesting dialogue on China than perhaps you get elsewhere. As I said, it's a visceral connection. And the third point in this line is that from an Indian location, someone like Professor Mohanty, with his disciplinary affiliation, can rather uniquely translate into plain English what is otherwise extremely opaque, namely the jargonistic terminology of Chinese policymakers. The things like the three represents. Well, what is that about? The three rural programs, which one did we have in mind? Harmonious society, for heaven's sake, what do they mean? The 5 imbalances to be corrected by a scientific outlook. Come on, I mean, what's that? The 4 comprehensives, it gets worse and worse. And now we have the One Belt, One Road, or the BRI. That also needs translation. And he attempts to bring all that home. And as others have commented, but perhaps not enough, this book has shown a unique ability to marry the macro policy pronouncements and so on with developments on the ground at a local level in terms of local level politics and politicking in a small township in eastern China. Now, my interest in the comments I really wanted to make are from my disciplinary perspective as a sociologist or social anthropologist. And for me, this complementarity of the macro and micro perspective is something which we can't do very well. Or rather, the sociologists take the former, and the anthropologists take the latter, and never the twain will meet. So that is a problem. The second thing is the time, methodologically speaking, is the time dimension. Now, recall here that his fieldwork was not at all the classical type of fieldwork of functionalist anthropology as we have learned to expect it. In that model, a field worker is supposed to go to the field to spend a minimum of 12 months, which is like one agricultural cycle or one whole year, doing their field work. and then, if they can possibly be dragged out of the field, to come out and write it all up. Now, Professor Mohanty did this book by going in and out for a few days, a couple of weeks, a month, or some periods of that order, intermittently over these 30 plus. He keeps on saying 30 years, but my arithmetic says it's 35, going on 40. It's like my age, you know. So, to do this is really quite an achievement, and it's quite an achievement from the perspective of my discipline. Secondly, we are all familiar with the modality of the restudy. You go to a place at one period in time, you study it intensively. 20 years later or 30 years later, you go back and you do it again. And you say, look, what's been changing? So we have books, famous books in anthropology like Scarlett Epstein's South India, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. So there we have a restudy. But he has had to do this diachronic monitoring on the hop. And I think that is really it's quite a challenge to do this and to make a sensible narrative out of it, even if one might not agree with the same things that he thought important, as some of this panel have said, or the way the other aspects of what he's gone about it. But my own fascination, and here I come into the anecdotal mode, is that the place that he went to, the most famous book, one of the classics of economic anthropology, is Fei Xiaotong's Peasant Life in China, published in 1937. It was his PhD at the LSE in the previous year, working with the famous anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, whose study of primitive trading networks in the South Pacific is another monograph of economic anthropology, which I once taught in a class in JNU. And now Fei's book is really interesting. It deals with the same region, more or less, of China, at least round the Taiyuan Lake, in Jiangsu province. It deals with the household economy as the basic unit of economic organization. And what he talked about was the insufficiency of agriculture for supporting the household economy. Basically, he came up with a descriptive analysis which showed that agriculture, this is rice agriculture, was only one aspect of the household economy. There was also animal husbandry, fishing, mulberry growing, trading in mulberry, silk rearing, and spinning. All of these together as a package made the mixed economy of the household in that area. And he investigated this at a time which resonated with my JNU students when we talked about it. Because suddenly, in the global economy of the early 1930s, the price of silk plummeted because the Japanese had got hold of it and the Chinese market crashed. And here we see we see Fei Xiaotong investigating a crisis situation in which one of the legs of the local economy had completely crashed. And his solution to this was the initiation, something that was done by his sister, the initiation of cooperatives. Now, all of those of us who've looked at the history of the handloom industry, of the Gandhian movement, know exactly what was being talked about and the disaster of the enmeshment within the global system at that point. Now, Fei Xiaotong also did a restudy. He did one in about 1956-57 during the 100 Flowers period, and he paid very heavily for it subsequently. He was sent to the countryside, he suffered privations, he was out of the public eye. Even the American Anthropological Society didn't know if he was alive or dead, and he certainly paid heavily. However, he bounced back after the Gang of Four and restudied along with other people, cautiously, I would say, in 1980. Now, I won't go into that anymore, but just to emphasize this business of household economy, household building strategies so that the household is a viable entity, and the very fascinating data he had on the female adverse sex ratios in that area of China, which were in that period, if my memory serves me right, were between 135 and 140 males per 100 females. I mean, it's like a world shocker. Even Haryana would be proud of such figures. And he also explored in this book and in his book, The Chinese Gentry, on the importance of networks of kinship, of networks of marriage, of networks of marketing areas. And all of these, I think, made this particular region one in which there is a past history and a backstory, which one sees being followed up, as I say, in a very visceral way, by Professor Mahanti's book. Now let me tell you a sad story. This book is about a township, so-called a xiang, called Hela, but I can't pronounce it properly because that's the local dialect. And Helie, is that right? In standard Mandarin. And at one stage I got an opportunity to apply for, on the basis of my reading really of Fei Xia Tung, a sort of opportunity to restudy this particular area. So knowing that Professor Mahanti had been there already, I asked to read his manuscript. Well, I am afraid to say I was shocked at an omission, which is no longer there. That was, he never mentioned women or the gender issue, even though we had staring in our face these things like these sex ratios, the division of labor, and all that sort of thing. Fortunately, I myself, Professor Mrs. Mahanti, and even his students, like Ritu, have subsequently corrected and enlightened him, and he is now one of the feminist political scientists in our midst. However, what he hasn't done, I think, in this book is what I thought that I wanted to do, which is look at household composition again in terms of kinship relations of kinship, marriage, inheritance, and so on. Now, what happened next is a rather sad story, because I did in fact receive this ICSSR fellowship. Many in this room may have received. In those days, and I'm talking now about the mid-1990s, not ancient history, where the Indian Council for Social Science Research provided 6 months field work for Indian academics in China. One person could hog it all for 6 months. 6 people could live for 1 month each. And in our case, we could have 6 weeks each. Now, considering that some of them didn't know the Chinese language, this was a ridiculous situation. And in our case, where there were 4 of us, but it turned out that since it was decided bureaucratically that we could only have 3 weeks, not 6 weeks each, because we would need to be accompanied by an interpreter. I felt I could somehow manage. And indeed, in every one of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has branches in every province, and they could perfectly well manage. So now we were stuck with 3 weeks. And then I found that everyone had read very carefully in Beijing, had read very carefully my proposal. They really tried very hard to enable me to do what I wanted. But it appears that the village, the township rather, of Hela didn't exist. I was certainly taken to Wuxi while my interpreter went shopping in the newly built malls, which were very glamorous. I was taken on improving visits to schools and medical facilities and women's federations thing. And every time I asked pathetically, where is Hela Township and why I'm not there, people just sort of looked back like, what is she talking about? Well, one of it may be this dialect variation, but the other point is that the bureaucratic arrangements had been made, and even if they could find Hela Township, they could never get me there because the arrangements were already made, and that was that. So, and of course, one other thing happened, which I'll complete this story with, was that this was no longer a rural village. This was a suburban village, which is, attached to the city of Wuxi. Therefore, its administration was of a different order, and therefore, Hela Township no longer existed in the form it had. Now, let's fast forward 10 years to 2006. And Professor Mohanty and I traveled to a China Studies conference in Shanghai. I think it's still an annual event. And he planned a trip to Wuxi, and I was privileged to go along with him, and to the village of, or rather the township of Hela. Now, when we got to Wuxi, we went to the place where Hela Township was meant to have been relocated. And correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Mohanty, there was a multi-story building in the process of demolition. And it was no longer there. So they'd gone from their little huts, I suppose, or stone cottages on canals and so on, into the city. They'd been housed in a big building, and then the big building was demolished. So where were they? Well, nothing stops a committed field worker like Professor Mohanty. And he asked and he asked and he asked, and believe it or not, local people did know where Hela, whatever it was called now, was now located. And it is now, what is it, an urban neighborhood. So, after many interesting rides, we tracked down the urban neighborhood. And we tracked down the former headman and village headman that he had. And asking our way, it was just like India, we weren't out of our depths really. We came to the Hela Township, which was in sort of DDA, SFS type, housing, 3 stories, steps to climb. And we went up the steps and we met his host people, the ex-village headman and his wife. And this was, for me, an extraordinary experience, because it was like they were receiving, after many years, a son coming home. With their modest resources, I can't imagine a more wonderful welcome and a more warm welcome to a field worker returning and to a colleague from another country so much respected. But the lesson from all this, and please, I must apologize for all my garrulousness, but that the lesson is that we have in India, we have to multiply our opportunities for long-term fieldwork and language training in China if we ever want to repeat this tour de force or exceed it and do better. The other thing that we haven't been able to do, and I'm really serious about this, things are changing, things have changed, the pace is too glacial. The other thing that I reflected on when I went back to my sad report, which I sent to the ICSSR, of the ill-fated first attempt to find Village, township, was that we have never been able to collectively engage in the sort of studies which can yield thick data on particular regions of the country China. I think we are getting somewhat there in our studies of Yunnan province, but when I invited myself to fill in the gaps in Professor Mahanti's work from my perspective as a sociologist, I was thinking that we were doing, as ICS fellows, we were doing a collective project which would add up by our collective work. And that is something which maybe we're too individualistic, maybe interdisciplinary work is really too hard to swallow, but we have not been able to get those things off the ground. And if I look around me at what happened with American scholarship in the 70s and early 80s, this was one of the means, that is, collective interdisciplinary work at a local level. This is one of the ways in which some good things got off the ground. And I wish that it might happen someday, but, well, things are looking up. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. As you can see, Patricia has been personally involved with the journey of this book. It has been a journey which took nearly 25 years, from elusive quest of Hala Township, finally she nailed down the place, to critiquing the first draft of the book way back in 2005. Well, now we have some time for discussion. The floor is open for discussion, and I'll also invite the panelists in case they wish to pose some questions to each other. Suresh?
I have not read the book, therefore it may be a question of ignorance really. But I was there in China from 1988 to 90, and I think I agree with what you said, that basically it really took off in 1991 on the basis of the reforms and the changes which had taken place in China till 1990. There are two areas where in fact I thought that basically this kind of rapid growth or meteoric growth in China was essentially because of the consumerism which had been unleashed because of the rural reforms. The surplus income which was available to the people in China at that time, and they were able to use. And now, I really don't know whether that consumerism put in enough money for the people to, basically kickstart that kind of, which we didn't. Unfortunately, in India, the reforms did not encourage the consumerism really at that time, which was the difference in China. But I would like to have a comment from Professor Mohanty on that. But second thing is capital formation. I wonder whether you have commented on the capital formation, which took place in the 90s at that time, and which also led to the huge NPAs in the banking sector, which continues to plague the industry.
Jairam raised the issue.
Questions are up to the author.
Panelists can also respond.
Author and you are related. This is a demographic issue.
I'll appreciate if the questions, if possible, could be posed to either author or individual panelists.
don't you think this demographic change you mentioned, India's population has more assets than the Chinese? In terms of, you mentioned the youth is growing, all that. I consider, as a sociologist, that as an asset, not as an
We'll take 3 questions or comments and then respond from this side.
I'm a little, it was a fascinating discussion, and it's a book I certainly will read. Having lived in China in the 80s and have followed since then, I'm still not clear as to what is the trap or success trap. You alluded to the riding the tiger. Is the tiger of rapid growth, which is that you cannot, if you are model, your paradigm is based on rapid growth, if you slow down, it takes you, or is it the tiger of an authoritarian system, or is it the tiger of transition? Could be three. So I'm not quite clear. To me, otherwise what you're saying is, as a country develops, what happens is a poor country's problem become a middle country problem, or a sector, in health. We worry about nutrition in the beginning, then when you get rich, you worry about cancer. So that's normal revolution. So where is the success track?
Manu, maybe we can respond to first set of questions.
I think the answer you'll find if you read the book. My CEO says, I buy the book and read it. I think some of the questions raised by the panelists, I'll come back later. These 2 issues, I'll get up.
Sir, mic is on.
And the rural demand. Indeed, that is my proposition, contrary to Jayaram's proposition. That I do believe that the rural reforms of the first decade, 15 years, created the rural demand for the industrial goods to get a market, get an adequate market, and also contribute to infrastructure building out of local funds and social infrastructure building by contributing to health and education out of the